Go ahead, counsel.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. LeGrand, you mentioned that a new management team was being formed to manage Mr. Jackson's affairs around the time you began to represent Mr. Jackson, right?
Part of my direction from Mr. Jackson and Mr. Konitzer was to assist them in developing a new team for cash management, accounting, bookkeeping, and new lawyers with respect to creative elements.
Did you have a lot of contact with Mr. Jackson?
All object is vague.
Overruled.
At different times during the 3 or 4 months that I was most active in representation, it would vary. I mean, when we were focused on the Granada pieces, we had some telephone conferences. The first conference was a couple of hours. At other times, my communication with Mr. Jackson was much more brief.
And who was ultimately part of the new management team?
Well, the cash management, initially a company, and I don't remember the name, but the principals were Ed Grossman and Michael Stern, were selected to take over cash management from Barry Siegel. That ultimately was changed in a few weeks. And the firm of, it's Alan Whitman. I'm not sure of the firm name. It's Fox, Marty Fox, Whitman, and another couple partners.
And were you communicating with Mr. Konitzer in this regard?
Oh, yes.
Were you communicating with Mr. Weisner in this regard?
Less so, but yes.
And was it your impression that Mr. Konitzer and Mr. Weisner were trying to take over the management of Mr. Jackson's business?
Yes.
Was it your impression that they wanted Mr. Jackson kept out of a lot of the day-to-day discussions?
Objection. Foundation.
Sustained.
Did you consider Mr. Jackson to be very sophisticated in financial or legal matters?
Objection. Foundation.
Sustained.
Did you have daily discussions with Konitzer?
During the time period from the end of January until, I would say, mid-March, there were probably a few days that I did not have a conversation with Mr. Konitzer.
And do you recall Mr. Konitzer communicating that no one was to contact Mr. Jackson directly but him?
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled.
No, I was never instructed by Mr. Konitzer that I could not contact Mr. Jackson.
Do you recall Mr. Konitzer sending memos around basically saying Mr. Jackson is to be kept out of the daily detail?
Not specifically. I just remember that Mr. Konitzer wanted to be.
Objection. Not responsive.
I think it is responsive.
Sustained. All strike after, not specifically.
What were Mr. Konitzer's directives to you with respect to whether or not Mr. Jackson was to be involved in the detail of management?
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled.
Mr. Konitzer wanted to serve Mr. Jackson as the overall manager of business affairs for Mr. Jackson, and that Mr. Jackson would have ultimate authority and decision-making, but that Mr. Konitzer would serve as, the day-to-day manager, and that was my understanding.
And did you discuss legal matters involving Mr. Jackson with Mr. Konitzer?
Yes.
And how often during that period of time do you think you did that?
There were legal matters discussed. There were financial matters discussed. There were business considerations discussed. Sometimes, that would be 2 or 3 times a day. Sometimes we would have meetings. And, there were a few days where I did not speak to Mr. Konitzer during this couple of months of somewhat frenzied activity.
Now, at some point in time did you become suspicious of Mr. Konitzer and Mr. Weisner?
Yes.
Objection. Well, move to strike. Leading.
Overruled.
I can't recall if there was an answer, Your Honor. I apologize. Could I?
The answer was, yes.
Thank you, Your Honor. Why did you become suspicious of Konitzer and Weisner?
I became concerned that they were in a position to divert funds. I was concerned about having appropriate documentation for tax purposes for Mr. Jackson and his companies. And in general, I began to disagree with some of Mr. Konitzer's decisions on matters and felt that he was making bad decisions, I guess is the way to say it. So I became suspicious of his motives and actions.
Could you please explain what you were suspicious of?
I was.
Objection. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
You mentioned you were suspicious of financial matters involving Konitzer, right?
Yes.
Please explain.
Well, ultimately there was another attorney involved who was serving as the escrow agent for some funds, and I asked him for an accounting in order to get Alan Whitman up to speed on some disbursements, payments, payables, etc. And that accounting came from this attorney, and it indicated that there had been about $900,000, I don't remember the exact number, but it was many hundreds of thousands of dollars that had been disbursed to Ronald Konitzer or Dieter Weisner. I mean, the combination was in hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I spoke to a couple of the lawyers that, were providing representation, and I ultimately wrote a letter within, a couple of days of learning of this. I wrote a letter to Mr. Konitzer asking him to account for this money.
Was the amount you were concerned about approximately $965,000?
Yeah, without seeing it today. But that sounds like approximately the right number, yes.
Would it refresh your recollection if I show you your letter?
Yes, it would.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
May I see what you've got there, counsel?
Mr. LeGrand, have you had a chance to review that document?
Yes.
Does it refresh your recollection about your concerns involving Mr. Konitzer?
Yes, the aggregate amount of disbursements that I set forth in that letter was $965,000.
And where did that amount come from, if you remember?
I believe the source of that funds was the Fox. Some of the Fox payments with regard to the Take-Two video production.
Did you ever get a response to your expression of concern?
Yes.
What was it?
Objection. Hearsay. Foundation.
I think the question is vague. I can't rule on the objection.
Okay. You mentioned the rebuttal show, correct?
Take-Two, yes.
Please explain what Take-Two was.
Take-Two was a video production produced in collaboration with Fox. Brad Lackman Productions was primary. They were Fox's primary representatives for the production. Maury Povich was the narrator. It largely consisted of video of Debbie Rowe from her interview with, I think it was Ian Drew at the Globe, and video of, shot by Hamid Moslehi. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. But it was video shot by Hamid that was outtakes, so to speak, our video shot of Bashir with Michael. Some of it was video of Martin Bashir filming Michael Jackson, or filming at Neverland, or, but that was, two primary components was those two sets of video.
And were you involved in the production of that product?
Well, I'm a lawyer. I'm not a videographer, editor or a graphic artist. I facilitated, again, I hired a law firm to do copyright work with respect to that video. One of my associates in the firm, a lady named Anne-Marie Levy, was coordinating most of the copyright work between this other firm and Brad Lockman's in-house lawyer on copyrights and the Fox people. I ultimately negotiated the contract with Fox. I believe it was, Marissa Fermin was the vice president of Fox that I worked with to get a contract for that production.
And was it your understanding that Konitzer and Weisner had a role in that production?
They were involved in the discussions as to the contract, the terms of the contract. At least Ronald Konitzer reviewed the draft agreements, and I discussed them with him. I'm not sure, I don't know what all his involvement was. I mean, Mr. Konitzer had things he did that didn't directly involve me, so.
Why did you think Konitzer and Weisner had stolen $965,000 from Mr. Jackson?
Well, because.
I'll object as misstates the evidence in terms of the word, stolen.
Sustained.
Why did you think Konitzer and Weisner had diverted $965,000 from Mr. Jackson?
Because the report I got from this other lawyer showed those disbursements.
And when you saw the record of those disbursements, what did you do?
I spoke to several of the other lawyers that were representing Mr. Jackson, and agreed that I should write a letter to Mr. Konitzer asking him to account.
Did you ever find out what he had done with the money?
No, I was terminated by Mr. Jackson as counsel within, 2 weeks, maybe, of that letter to Mr. Konitzer.
Did you ever have Konitzer, Weisner, excuse me. Let me start with something else. Do you know who someone named Mark Schaffel is?
Yes.
And who is Mark Schaffel, to your knowledge?
Mark Schaffel is an independent producer. He had worked on one of Mr. Jackson's albums at one point. He was involved in working with Brad Lackman Productions to create the Take-Two video.
At some point, did you have Schaffel, Konitzer and Weisner investigated?
Again, on behalf of Mr. Jackson, I engaged an independent private investigative company, and asked them to investigate the backgrounds of Mr. Konitzer and Mr. Weisner and Mr. Schaffel.
Why?
Objection. Improper opinion.
Overruled.
Because I was suspicious of their motives, and some of their statements didn't quite seem to add up.
Did you think they were stealing from Mr. Jackson?
Objection. Improper opinion. No foundation.
Sustained.
What did you do to have Schaffel, Konitzer and Weisner investigated?
Working with one of my partners at Hale Lane he's a former U.S. assistant prosecutor and had good relationships with a couple of private investigating firms, we selected a firm, got them a retainer and asked them to do background checks and let us know what they found.
Now, you say your partner was an assistant prosecutor. What do you mean?
Objection. Relevancy.
Sustained.
You hired an investigative firm, correct?
Yes.
To start investigating these people, right?
Yes.
And others involving Mr. Jackson, right?
Yes.
You were doing it on behalf of Mr. Jackson, correct?
Yes.
Objection. Foundation.
Overruled. The answer is in. Next question.
Were you doing this to protect Mr. Jackson?
Yes.
Are you the one who arranged for the investigative firm to do this investigation?
My partner Mr. Gibson and I did, yes.
Okay.
He actually had the primary contact with the investigative firm.
Did you know whether or not Konitzer or Weisner had managed to sign documents for Mr. Jackson?
Objection. Vague.
Sustained.
Do you know what a power of attorney is?
Yes.
What is a power of attorney?
A power of attorney is a legal document authorizing one person to act in the place instead of another.
And does a power of attorney allow one to sign on behalf of someone else?
It can.
Did you ever learn whether or not Mr. Jackson had given a power of attorney to either of these two people?
Yes, I believe he did.
Did that concern you?
Yes.
Why?
I was concerned that they could abuse that power or exceed the authority of the power.
Did you do anything about that?
Yes. I spoke to some of the other lawyers that were representing Mr. Jackson, and we agreed that we would ask Mr. Jackson to revoke the power of attorney.
Was that done?
Yes.
Now, at some point, you learned that Konitzer had arranged to have you terminated, right?
Objection. Hearsay. Leading.
Sustained.
Was the investigation going on when your duties were terminated?
I'm not sure of the exact timing. I'm just not sure today. It's been a couple years.
Okay, now, your former partner and you were both former prosecutors, correct?
Objection. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
Was the investigation into Konitzer, Weisner and Schaffel conducted by you and your partner?
Mr. Gibson, my partner, and I discussed the need for some investigative background material. We agreed it was appropriate, and we engaged the investigative firm on behalf of Mr. Jackson.
And when your services were terminated, do you know if that investigation was still going on?
Objection. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
Who chose the investigative firm?
Objection. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
Where was the investigative firm located?
Objection. Relevancy.
Overruled.
Again, recollection, I believe they were based in New York.
Did you ever meet Janet Arvizo?
Yes.
Do you know approximately when that was?
I was at Neverland in early February of 2003, the day the 60 Minutes film crew was there. And I met Janet Arvizo during that day. I was there for most of a Saturday at the ranch.
Did you have much contact with her that day?
Not much. I mean, we spoke. Introduced ourselves. There were a lot of people in and out of the ranch that day. We had an entire film crew. Mr. Garrigus was there with one of his associate lawyers. Mr. Konitzer was there. I think Mr. Weisner was there. I'm not sure anymore. It was quite a zoo, so to speak.
And what were your impressions of Ms. Arvizo on that particular day?
Objection. Foundation.
Sustained.
Did you see Mrs. Arvizo at Neverland on that particular day?
Yes.
Did you speak to her?
Yes.
Did you speak to her at length?
I don't think so.
Did you see her throughout the day?
Saw her off and on.
Okay. Did she appear upset to you?
Objection. Leading.
Sustained.
Did you observe her demeanor on that particular day?
Yes.
What were your observations?
She seemed satisfied with being there. She expressed support for Mr. Jackson. That was pretty much what I recall.
Did you see any other members of her family at Neverland on that particular day?
I saw Gavin Arvizo and a young lady, I think her name is Star. And then there was, I believe, Gavin's brother, but I don't recall his name. They were just kind of running around. I mean, literally. They'd be boisterous kids running through the house, and then burst out a door and go somewhere. Gavin indicated he had been riding bumper cars and having a pretty good time that morning.
Do you recall whether or not you discussed the lawsuit in England with Mrs. Arvizo?
I really don't recall that. I'm just not sure where we were in the lawsuit timeframe. There was so much going on.
Were there any representatives of the media at Neverland on that particular day?
Oh, just Ed Bradley and the entire film crew for 60 minutes.
And did Mrs. Arvizo appear to be in the proximity of Ed Bradley and the 60 Minutes crew?
Oh, yes. I mean, I remember at one point we were kind of seated near the kitchen. There's a video screen, TV on the wall. Nickelodeon was playing, and Mrs. Arvizo was sitting on the couch, and I think it was Michael Rodesky. I'm not sure the exact name, but he was like a real production type guy, and his assistant, a woman, they were sitting on the couch. And I was there for just a few minutes, and then I left the room. But I saw them later. They were all still sitting there, so.
Did you have any communication with Ms. Arvizo after that date?
I'm not sure. There was some phone calls later, a few weeks later. There was some phone calls about the execution of some releases that I had drafted, and I'm not sure if I spoke to Mrs. Arvizo or not.
Do you recall?
It was like, 10 or 11 o'clock at night, I believe. 10 o'clock at night. And I was living at that point on about 4 or 5 hours of sleep for about 6 weeks, and I'm just not sure.
You say you drafted some releases. What are you referring to?
Video consents. We were trying to, again, this is all relating to the Take Two video. My assistant, Anne-Marie Levy, had drafted a form of video consent, release, authorization for a person's image to be used in a televisual broadcast. It's a pretty standard Hollywood-type form, and we were seeking those from anybody who might appear in Take Two.
Now, was it your understanding that the Arvizo family was going to be involved in Take Two?
The answer is, I'm not sure whether they were or weren't going to be. The idea was to shoot footage and then work with Fox, Brad Lackman Productions, and edit that footage to create a decent program. It wasn't my decision what footage would get used, but there was a desire to include them, to get some footage of them. Whether or not it would get used, I don't know.
And you say you drafted these releases, right?
Yes.
And then what did you do with them?
Gosh, we distributed releases to, I'm pretty sure we gave them to Brad Lackman Productions. My assistant, Anne-Marie Levy, was really the primary person handling that. I know she had communications with the Brad Lackman folks. I'm fairly sure she would have sent them to Mark Schaffel, because he had some people who were involved. He was helping coordinate Hamid Moslehi, who was actually doing some of the video. Anne-Marie, under my direction, had been coordinating the documents with attorney Iris Finsilver on behalf of Debbie Rowe for her appearance. So a number of people would have gotten those forms.
Do you recall your being in contact with various companies involving the production of Take Two?
I'm not sure what you mean by various companies. I worked with, Marissa Fermin at Fox. We had a lot of dialogue with Brad Lackman. We hired, a law firm in Las Vegas to assist with copyrights. We had discussions with Schaffel. I'm not sure who else. I don't know if I'm pretty sure I talked to Hamid at one point in that whole process.
Who is Brad Lackman?
Brad is Brad Lackman Productions is an independent film company that was selected by Fox to produce the Take Two video.
And were you communicating with the lawyers on behalf of Brad Lackman Productions?
Yes.
Why?
We needed to have releases from anybody whose image would appear in the video. There was music being selected. A lot of Mr. Jackson's music was to accompany the video. We had to get the appropriate copyright releases executed, and there's money involved in making payments for a number of these sorts of things. And my role again, as an attorney, I was, trying to facilitate that process and make sure that we had appropriate lawyers carrying out those processes, and from time to time make sure I would have direct conversation to make sure there weren't glitches, to understand where any holdups were, and try to motivate everyone to be effective and get the job done.
And I believe you said you were in contact with people associated with Fox, correct?
Yes.
And what were you doing with them?
Primarily negotiating the contract for payment for the production.
Did you have a lot of contact with representatives of Fox in that regard?
I had a lot of contact with Marissa Fermin during that period. She was really the representative of Fox I dealt with.
Now, you said you were getting 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night during this period, right?
Yes, sir.
Why was that?
The combination of tasks that I was propelled into was pretty overwhelming. We would typically start the day with a teleconference with the United Kingdom, because of the time difference, and then by the end of, so the middle of my day, late day, would be US work. And then fairly often I would be back on the phone with the United Kingdom at night, sometimes 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, because that's morning in the UK. It's the next day already. So sleeping became problematic. Plus, quite honestly, my mind was just full. There was so much content coming to me on a daily basis, I couldn't sleep. I'd just lay there and have things going through my head and make little to-do lists in my mind.
Now, you talked about the concept of copyright. What do you mean?
Well, copyright is a statutory right in the United States. I believe there's some common law associated with copyright. But copyright, there's a Federal Copyright Act, and copyright provides protection for creations, artwork, books, media. It's not like patents. You can't copyright a concept. You can copyright a creative work.
And what were you doing for Mr. Jackson in the area of copywriting?
I'm not a copyright lawyer by trade, but I understand enough to know that copyright is very important with respect to televisual production. And so, I engaged appropriate lawyers having expertise, patent, trademark lawyers who work regularly in the copyright field, to help make sure that copyright was preserved for Mr. Jackson, or where other person's copyrighted work would be used, that we had the appropriate release and authority, because copyright infringement can carry pretty significant penalties under the statutes.
Were you involved at all in issues involving licensing?
Yes.
What were you doing?
I interviewed and ultimately recommended that Michael Jackson, MJJ Productions, etc., hire Haber International, I think is the name of the company, to do international distribution of the Take-Two video under license. The contract with Fox specifically provided that basically Michael Jackson preserved the right to distribute internationally.
Mr. LeGrand, there was no secret around the world that the Take-Two show was being developed, right?
I'm not aware of it being a secret, no.
I mean, it was well publicized that a Take-Two production was being developed, right?
I don't know if it was well publicized or not, but there certainly was some publicity.
And lawyers for various entities were working around the clock to help get the Take-Two production completed, right?
Well, I would say a number of people were working very, very hard, including lawyers, to get that production done quickly. And the pressure was Fox wanted the production for Sweeps Week.
What do you mean by that?
In the television world, there's what, as I understand it, Sweeps Week is when the rating companies analyze the viewers for, and this is real important for pricing of commercials, and it really determines a value of TV shows and such. So Sweeps Week is ratings week, and it's something that's very important to the various networks to have high ratings during Sweeps Week.
And how did you learn that Fox was concerned about that time pressure?
Well, Marissa Fermin told me they wanted the show for that purpose.
During this period of time when you were getting 4 to 5 hours of sleep a night, how much of your day was devoted to the development of the Take-Two project?
It would vary day to day. That was not my primary focus in representing Mr. Jackson and trying to coordinate all the lawyers. During that same time frame, the decision had been made to replace Barry Siegel as money manager with Ed Grossman and Michael Stern's company. That, ultimately, Ed Grossman and Michael Stern decided they really could not handle the business, and then we transitioned to Mr. Whitman. That was extremely time-consuming. Took a significant part of my time and effort. There were other matters that came up. I'm not sure exactly when. I had to communicate with, I think it's Brian Wolf at the Lavely Singer firm about some litigation, fairly minor litigation cases that were going on at the time. I had the entire US-UK litigation in pretty much full gear. There were just a host of issues that needed attention.
Were you dealing with other countries besides England when it came to licensing any footage involving the Take-Two show?
Yes. Haber International was doing the primary negotiation, but Fred and/or his associate, George Scanlon, would contact me with respect to approvals of, or seeking approvals for various licensing deals. At some point, we had some, fairly significant discussions. I remember in particular Sky Broadcasting. We had several conference calls and some extensive correspondence with Sky Broadcasting over the licensing for Take-Two. They're overseas. I'm not even sure where. I don't know whether it was UK. I think it was the UK itself. I'm not sure.
Do you recall whether or not you were involved in any contacts with the media at this period of time involving the development of the Take-Two show?
I had emails, phone calls, personal visits from various networks and shows expressing interest in Take-Two before we ended up contracting with Fox. There was, and I won't call it a bidding war, but there was certainly interest by several parties, and proposals were being submitted to me.
To your knowledge, was the development of the Take-Two program part of a conspiracy to kidnap the Arvizo family?
Objection. Argumentative. Calls for a conclusion.
Sustained.
Was the work you were doing, as far as you're concerned, part of any conspiracy to violate the rights of the Arvizos?
Same objection.
Sustained.
Did you ever conspire to violate the rights of the Arvizo family in the development of the Take-Two show?
No.
Were you aware of any efforts during the production of this show to falsely imprison the Arvizo family at Neverland?
Objection. No foundation. Also calls for a legal conclusion.
I think the problem is with the word, falsely imprison. All sustain the objection.
While you were doing all of the work that you described around the world, various law firms, with the distribution company, with Fox, with Haber, was it ever your understanding that, as part of that project, the Arvizos were to be held against their will?
Same objection as to calls for a conclusion and no foundation. Also hearsay.
Overruled. You may answer.
No, I have no knowledge that the Arvizos were to be held or being held against their will.
During this frantic time period that you have described, did you have any knowledge of whether or not the media was focusing their attention on Mr. Jackson?
Yes, there was significant media attention throughout the world following the initial broadcast of the Bashir video in the UK.
And would that media attention have gone on through January, February and March of 2003, to your knowledge?
I'm not sure about, I'm not sure of the exact dates. It was very late January or 1st of February that the broadcast was in the UK. It was that, right at that time frame was the first broadcast. So the media started, when the clips were being produced and the Granada broadcast was being publicized in the UK. The broadcast in the UK kind of started a significant amount of publicity. And then within a few days, the program was broadcast in the US, so how long that continued, was it still at that level of media in March? I think it was tailing off some compared to what it was in those first couple weeks of February.
Now, you've indicated that you had some involvement in Mr. Jackson's financial affairs, right?
Yes.
And please describe what your involvement was.
Mr. Konitzer, Mr. Jackson asked me to assist in replacing Barry Siegel as the cash manager for Mr. Jackson. We also looked at the possibility of replacing his tax team. The accountants had actually prepared tax returns. Mr. Siegel did not prepare tax returns. Ultimately, that decision was made not to change that accounting firm. As part of that process, initially Mr. Grossman, Mr. Stern's company was hired, and I would communicate with them on, often a daily or, sometimes hourly, certainly quite often with regard to financial matters. Also, during the same time, I would have people like Evie Tavashi would call and say that Michael needed money for something and would ask me to facilitate that. So I also was in the process of reviewing the various loan documents. I was trying to get a firm grasp of Mr. Jackson's financial affairs, try to understand, ascertain his assets, his liabilities, and that was all wrapped up in this transitioning of trying to put a new team into place.
Do you recall doing any work involving the Sony ATV music catalog?
Well, I got a copy of the Sony ATV documents. I had one of my commercial associates analyze those documents and generate a report summarizing the content. These are very voluminous, detailed, complex documents, and I had an associate review them and analyze them and I believe produce a report to me.
And what is the Sony ATV music catalog?
Well, Sony ATV is a joint venture where Mr. Jackson and Sony have ownership in the company that owns a variety of copyrights and rights to music, and basically is, as I recall, that Mr. Jackson contributed his ownership of the Beatles catalog and other music that he had acquired rights to. He contributed that into the joint venture. Sony put some of its music licensing rights into the joint venture. And then Sony continued to, as a manager of the joint venture, acquire additional rights to music.
And why were you concerned about the Sony ATV music catalog?
Well, the Sony ATV joint venture represented a significant portion of Mr. Jackson's assets. His ownership interest in that entity was a very considerable portion. And I was somewhat surprised to find that Mr. Jackson really did not have a diversified portfolio of investments that, I'm somewhat used to in the more non-Hollywood commercial world that I've worked in.
Did you feel he had been poorly advised in the past?
Objection. Foundation. Hearsay.
Sustained.
Once you analyzed what the Sony ATV music catalog was, what did you do?
Well, at this time, by the time I had that analysis, a couple things happened. 1. I spoke to Mr. Konitzer and expressed to him that this was a much more complex set of documents than Mr. Konitzer had earlier indicated to me. He really did not understand the depth and complexity, the rights Mr. Jackson had and the limitations on Mr. Jackson's ability to, sell any interest in that particular asset. I found out, that there were loans. Bank of America, in particular, had a loan portfolio that was involved in this whole Sony ATV joint venture, as Mr. Jackson's interest was collateral, and his financial affairs were, fairly complex, and there wasn't a lot of liquidity there.
Now, at some point, you made some suggestions to Mr. Jackson about how to restructure his financial affairs, right?
Yes.
And why did you do that?
Within the first, I'd say, maybe 3 weeks or so, 4 weeks of representing Mr. Jackson, I learned that his current payables mid-February were in the range of $10 million. There was insufficient cash available to pay those payables on a current, timely basis. I came to understand that essentially most of his income primarily went to pay down a credit line and then he was allowed to draw, I think it was $2 million a month on the credit line. But there were significant constraints on his ability to draw against those credit funds, and the bulk of his assets were pledged for these credit lines. There was, actually, I think there's 2 different loans. But anyway, he was highly illiquid.
At one point, you suggested he consider selling his interest in the catalog, right?
Yes.
And it was your belief that if he did that, he could end up with $200 million after taxes, right?
Yes.
And that would be exclusive of royalty income, right?
Yes. Can I redress that? I wasn't sure about the tax consequences. At that point I really was not. I can't say I was up to speed on the tax history of his portfolio, his interest in the joint venture. That's all fairly complex. So my analysis was based on some assumptions, and qualified, to a degree. So the $200 million number, this was not meant to be precise. I was not in a position to give precision at that point in that analysis.
Did you talk to any financial experts before you gave that advice?
Well, I spoke to Alan Whitman, the CPA who was managing, I think by that time was managing Mr. Jackson's money. I spoke with another lawyer who was working with Mr. Jackson, a Mr. Malnick in Florida. I'm not sure, I'm fairly sure he's not a financial expert. I'm pretty sure I talked to Eric Joss at Paul Hastings about my analysis.
And you had suggested that Mr. Jackson restructure his financial affairs, correct?
Yes.
And you made suggestions as to how he could do that and avoid bankruptcy, right?
Yes.
And your conclusion was that there was a way to end up worth $200 million after taxes and excluding music royalties, correct?
That was my analysis, yes.
Okay, now, during the time that you represented Mr. Jackson, were you involved in any business opportunities involving Mr. Jackson?
Well, the Fox negotiations were a business opportunity. I know there were subsequent discussions with Fox for additional programs. I had discussions with Jack Sussman, I think he's at CBS, with regards to possible programs. Mr. Jackson indicated a desire to maybe do some film work. And I arranged an introduction to a law firm in Hollywood that really practices representing talent in the film and music arena. A young man named Howard Fishman, an attorney, was brought in. There were discussions with the movie director Bob Evans about producing a biography of Mr. Jackson's life. Those are the ones I remember. I'm sure there were more, but those were the primary discussions I recall.
And do you recall any discussions about marketing any products involving Mr. Jackson?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. One of the items that came to my attention during this couple of months was there had been a contract entered into sometime before. I'm not sure whether it was a year or 2 years, that allowed Mr. Jackson to buy out a company that had acquired the rights to merchandise a variety of goods under his name, I guess is the best way to say it. They had the right to produce, Jackson perfume, for example, are various goods with the Jackson name associated with it. And that contract needed to be paid off. There was a balance due to on an installment payment arrangement. There was a balance due for him to reacquire those rights. I did facilitate the payment being made so that those rights came back to Mr. Jackson. And there were a couple of negotiations, one I think was a perfume. I know there was something else, but I can't remember what it was. It wasn't big money, it was like $20 or $40,000. But there were other instances of opportunities for revenue for Mr. Jackson.
Do you recall, in February of 2003, Sony ATV offering to pay $10 million to purchase a Christmas song from Mr. Jackson?
You know, that sounds familiar. But I really don't have a specific recollection of that. It rings a bell with me, but...
Might it refresh your recollection if I show you a letter in that regard?
Sure.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
Have you had a chance to look at that document?
Yes.
Does it refresh your recollection about that issue?
Yes.
What do you recall about that?
I recall receiving the letter, a copy of the letter from Mr. Branca. And I remember I spoke to Mr. Konitzer. And I'm not sure what the ultimate outcome was. I believe Mr. Branca was told to pursue the discussions.
Do you remember any projects involving games relating to Mr. Jackson, video games, anything of that sort?
There were several discussions about the possibility of seeking license money, royalty money, for gaming machines in Nevada in particular. There were some suggestions that one or more of the major manufacturers might be interested in a Michael Jackson slot machine of some sort.
Now, you mentioned your discussions with a producer about a movie about Mr. Jackson's life?
Yes.
Would you please explain what you're talking about?
Well, Mr. Fishman and I attended a dinner one night at the residence of movie director Bob Evans, I think is his name. Robert Evans. And Mr. Evans was very enthusiastic about the possibility of producing a movie based on the life of Michael Jackson. And he wanted to negotiate for those rights.
Would it be accurate to say that while you were representing Michael Jackson in January, February, March of 2003, there was a constant swarm of business proposals from various parts of the world involving Mr. Jackson?
Objection. Leading and vague.
Sustained.
As to swarm of business proposals.
Was it part of your responsibilities to involve yourself in potential business opportunities involving Mr. Jackson?
Well, for that short time, I really was one of the primary facilitators for business transactions for Mr. Jackson, and several people brought proposals to me or informed me that there were proposals of various kinds. I'm not sure how much was my responsibility. As a lawyer, when clients ask for assistance, I give them assistance. Sometimes I was in the position where, somebody would say to me, "Gee, do you think this would be of interest?" Or another lawyer, would send me the contract, a proposal. I think the perfume contract actually came from Brian Wolf's law firm. So, a lot of this came to me, but I'm not sure how much of it was my responsibility.
Now, you're not a specialist in music law, right?
No.
During the time you were doing all of this work for Mr. Jackson, he also had a law firm doing his music legal work, correct?
Yes.
So all of the business opportunities or projects you're talking about are really separate and apart from the music business, right?
Yes.
And was it your understanding that business opportunities in the music area were going to another law firm at this point in time?
Objection. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
To your knowledge, while you were representing Mr. Jackson, how many law firms were involved in his affairs?
Well, the Cat and Muchin firm was providing representation in a couple pieces of litigation. The Ziffrin firm, John Branca in particular, was the primary music counsel. Lavely Singer was providing representation on a variety of matters, mostly litigation-related. There was my firm. There was Paul Hastings' law firm. There was Mark Garrigus. There was the solicitors in the United Kingdom, the barrister in the United Kingdom. I know I'm missing somebody. Oh, and I had another law firm in Las Vegas that was assisting on copyright work as well. So I don't know how many that is, but it's quite a few lawyers.
Do you remember, in March of 2003, discussions about a proposed television special involving Michael Jackson and Marlon Brando?
Yes.
What do you remember about that?
Not much. There was discussion about that possibility, of combining those two into a production. I never had direct contact with Marlon, or maybe I did. Well, I ultimately did speak to Marlon Brando and his counsel about putting together some sort of program. But it never got off the ground, as far as I know.
You were doing work for Mr. Jackson in the area of international trademarks, correct?
Some of the trademark paperwork came to me and I tried to route it to someone appropriate. I am not an expert in trademark work.
But what were you doing in that area for Mr. Jackson during January, February, and March of 2003?
Well, I was really just trying to coordinate and make sure that, if something came to me, I tried to make sure that it went to a lawyer that could appropriately handle it.
And to your knowledge, what was going on in that area, as far as lawyers are concerned?
Yeah, I really don't remember. That was a very minor part of the overall scope of what I was dealing with.
Were you referring trademark issues for Mr. Jackson to other law firms?
I think so, yes.
And was it your understanding that trademark issues were constantly coming up around the world involving Mr. Jackson?
Yes, there were. There was some things on the internet that involved his likeness that were being offered for sale, I think. There was a couple different, I'm not sure what to call them. I don't know that they were games or not, but they were interactive elements on the internet that used his image and likeness. The day I was fired, in March, I was having lunch with Alan Whitman and Brian Wolf from the Lavely Singer firm to talk about what kind of actions could be taken and what kind of costs would be associated with taking action to protect Mr. Jackson's image and likeness.
And was that a concern involving only the United States, or elsewhere?
Oh, no, it was worldwide in scope. The net knows no boundaries.
To handle those issues worldwide, what did you have to do?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, my approach was to find a qualified law firm like Lavely Singer, Brian Wolf and Marty Singer, and, have them engage the appropriate talent, as needed, around the world.
And to your knowledge, was that done?
I don't know.
Do you recall a project proposal involving Apple Computer during this period of time?
I remember some discussion about Apple Computer, and that Steve Jobs and Michael had a personal relationship, and that there might be some commercial opportunity with Apple, but I don't recall the details of any proposal.
Okay, and to your knowledge to date, Mr. Jackson has never gone bankrupt, has he?
I'm not aware of Mr. Jackson filing a petition in a federal bankruptcy court for relief, no.
Do you remember your firm issuing a letter to the team suggesting that no business proposals were to go directly to Mr. Jackson?
I don't specifically recall that letter, no.
Do you recall a draft letter to come from your firm to someone named Meskin?
Yes.
And do you recall the letter said no proposals are to go directly to Mr. Jackson?
Yes.
And why was that?
Mr. Meskin was one of the people present at the dinner party at director Robert Evans' house, and I was not impressed with his approach. I did not think the terms he was suggesting to Howard Fishman and I were anything that Mr. Jackson should consider. And I was concerned, because during that dinner party, Mr. Meskin and Mr. Evans managed to take Mr. Jackson away from Mr. Fishman and I, for a short period, 20 minutes, half an hour. And I found out later that they tried to get him to sign.
Objection. Hearsay.
Sustained.
Did you find out in that regard that efforts were made to get Mr. Jackson to sign documents?
Objection. Hearsay. Leading.
Sustained.
Do you remember, when you were brought in to represent Mr. Jackson, Konitzer and Weisner telling you they intended to gain control of Mr. Jackson's financial affairs?
Yes.
Do you remember at that time Konitzer and Weisner telling you they wanted to gain control of Mr. Jackson's records, documents, and agreements?
Objection. Hearsay.
Overruled. You may answer.
Yes.
Do you remember, when you were brought on board, Konitzer and Weisner telling you they wanted to gain control of anything belonging to Mr. Jackson?
I'll make the same objection. And leading.
Overruled.
In general, Mr. Konitzer and Mr. Weisner wanted to take over overall management, of Michael Jackson's business affairs, financial affairs, and implement a new business plan for Mr. Jackson.
And they essentially told you in writing they wanted to control everything Mr. Jackson owned, right?
For the benefit of Mr. Jackson, yes.
Well, you then concluded they were doing it for their own benefit, didn't you?
Objection. Argumentative. Leading. Misstates the evidence.
Sustained.
You were retained in approximately January of 2003, right?
End of January, yes.
And how long did it take you to grow suspicious of what Konitzer and Weisner were doing to Mr. Jackson?
Objection. Argumentative. Leading. And asked and answered.
Overruled. You may answer.
Weeks. I mean, whether it was 4 weeks or 6 weeks, I'm not sure. But certainly by the end of February, early March period, I was very suspicious, and I'm not sure of the time frame. The first investigative report that I got just increased my degree of suspicion. But at the same time that some of this was going on with respect to my concerns about Mr. Konitzer and Mr. Weisner, Mr. Malnick had entered the scene and was asserting.
Objection. Narrative.
Sustained.
Who is Mr. Malnick?
He's an individual who lives in Florida.
And were you suspicious of anything he was doing involving Mr. Jackson?
Because I did not know Mr. Malnick, I was suspicious of him.
I'm going to object to an improper opinion. No foundation.
Overruled.
I became suspicious of everybody. It seems that everybody wanted to try to benefit from Mr. Jackson one way or another. But I did eventually cause the investigative service to give us some background on Mr. Malnick. But the report indicated he's a very wealthy man.
Objection. Hearsay.
Sustained.
You grew suspicious of what Mark Schaffel was doing to Mr. Jackson at some point, correct?
I grew suspicious that Mr. Schaffel was seeking to benefit from Mr. Jackson or being, in relationship to Mr. Jackson. My suspicion of Mr. Schaffel was different than my suspicion of Mr. Konitzer or Mr. Weisner.
Did you have much involvement with Mr. Schaffel in your work?
I had a fair amount of involvement with Mr. Schaffel at the very beginning of the development of the Take-Two production. And I was constantly trying to get Mark Schaffel out of the loop. I was trying to avoid his involvement or minimize his involvement in Mr. Jackson's affairs, and it was a struggle.
But did you ever meet Schaffel?
Yeah.
Where did you meet him?
I think I met him at his house the Friday night before the 60 Minutes Saturday at Neverland.
And why were you at Schaffel's home?
2. Because he had had conversations with Jack Sussman about CBS purchasing some of the rights to the footage. At that time, there wasn't a Take-Two, but we had footage. And so I met with Mark for that purpose, to discuss and also, I think I looked at some of the footage at that time. They had some of it on a screen, and I was able to watch some of the footage of Martin Bashir and Michael.
And approximately when was this, do you think?
I think it was the first week in February of 2003. I'm not sure whether that's the 7th, 8th or 9th, but it was around that first full weekend in February.
And was it your understanding that Schaffel was involved in the production of the Take-Two program?
Yes.
And how did you learn that?
I guess one answer is to say Mark Schaffel told me, but he's the one who I believe he's the one that worked to arrange the Ian Drew interview with Debbie Rowe and coordinate Hamid from iFilms to film that interview.
And were you involved in anything involving the Debbie Rowe interview?
Well, yes. We were involved with the preparation and exchange of documents to allow Debbie Rowe to engage in the interview and allow her image to be broadcast.
And did you draft those documents?
Well, I participated in them. Actually, my associate, Anne-Marie Levy, really did most of the work on that with Iris Finsilver. I did speak to Iris Finsilver, a couple times, I think. She was the counsel for Debbie Rowe.
And were your relations with her very professional?
Well, I think so.
Did there seem to be any objection on this lawyer's part to Debbie Rowe being interviewed?
She didn't express any objection to me.
Were you there when Debbie Rowe was interviewed?
No.
Did you learn about it at some point?
Yes.
How did you learn about it?
I'm not sure today who told me. It was probably Schaffel. Might have been Konitzer.
Were you involved in any of the filming of the Arvizo family for purposes of Take-Two?
No. I was never present during any filming of anybody for Take-Two.
Do you recall talking to anyone who spoke on behalf of the Arvizos when it came to their being filmed as part of the Take-Two project?
I don't recall.
Is the time I described, where you saw Janet at Neverland, the only time you recall ever physically seeing her?
I think that's right. I might have seen her again somewhere else, but I really don't have a specific recollection.
Do you remember ever talking to Janet Arvizo on the phone?
As I indicated earlier, I'm not sure if I actually spoke with her or if I was speaking to one of the people working with Schaffel. There were a couple people that were working on various pieces of that filming. And I don't remember specifically whether I spoke with Mrs. Arvizo or not.
Do you recall, in your discussions with representatives of Fox Television regarding the Take-Two project, whether or not the name Arvizo ever came up?
Yeah. I'm pretty sure it did. Because we needed, again, anybody who's going to be in, a televisual production needs to sign a consent, a release for the use of their image. And if the Arvizos were going to have any footage included, there had to be a release.
Do you recall, in your discussions with the distribution company, Lachman Productions, the name Arvizo ever coming up?
Well, I think it did, again in the context of we needed appearance consents and releases from everybody, because we had footage that had a lot of people in it. We were concerned. There was one set of footage that had a bunch of kids at Neverland, and we were concerned about those appearance consents.
You mentioned an individual named Haber, correct?
Yep, Fred Haber.
Do you remember ever discussing the Arvizos with Mr. Haber?
I'm just not sure.
As far as you're concerned, given all of the communications you had with all of these parties about the Take-Two project, was it any secret that the Arvizos were going to possibly participate?
I'm not aware of any secret about it, no.
In fact, the possibility of the Arvizos participating in the Take-Two project was something that was discussed constantly, right?
Objection. Leading.
Sustained.
To your knowledge, was anyone that you spoke with trying to keep the fact that the Arvizos might participate in the Take-Two project a secret?
No.
Approximately when do you think you first learned that there might be a possibility of the Arvizos participating in this television documentary involving Maury Povich?
Oh, I'm not sure. I mean, early February. Mid-February. Sometime in that time frame. This all went very quickly. I think the production aired by the end of February, so this was a very short time frame.
But certainly your discussions with representatives of Fox Television indicated that people at Fox thought the Arvizos might participate, right?
I don't know about Fox. I think Brad Lachman Productions, but I don't remember talking about it with Marissa Fermin.
Did you learn at some point that the Arvizo family had participated in an interview for purposes of the Take-Two project?
I believe some footage did get shot, yes.
Did you ever see it?
I never saw that footage, no.
Okay. Do you remember learning from someone that they had participated in an interview?
Yes. I'm just not sure when.
Do you know if you were at Schaffel's home before or after you learned the Arvizos had been interviewed?
Oh, I'm pretty sure it was before, because, I'm pretty sure it was before.
Now, at the period of time you're talking about, when this Take-Two project is being produced, to your knowledge, are the Arvizos still parties to the lawsuit in England?
No, they're not. No, they're not. And I believe the complaint with the Standards Board on their behalf was also withdrawn, but I'm not sure about that.
At some point, did you learn the Arvizos had hired a lawyer in Los Angeles?
Yes.
Do you know approximately when you learned the Arvizos had gone to a lawyer in Los Angeles?
I think it was the spring of 2004 that I was contacted by a lawyer who stated he represented the Arvizos. I'm not sure, whether that was February, March, April, but I think it was the spring of 2004.
Do you remember ever hearing from a lawyer named Dickerman?
Yes.
Okay, and did you learn at some point that a lawyer named Dickerman in Los Angeles was representing the Arvizos?
Yeah, Mr. Dickerman contacted me in that, I think it was spring of 2004.
And did you ever learn that at some point in time after they hired attorney Dickerman, they hired attorney Larry Feldman?
I never had any contact with Mr. Feldman. I think if I know that, it's only from the press.
Did you ever speak to Dickerman directly?
Yes.
Involving the Arvizos? How many times do you think you did that?
2, maybe 3 times did I speak with him. We exchanged some letters.
And at some point, he made a request that the Arvizos no longer participate in the British litigation, true?
Yes. Well, you have to excuse me. There's the litigation and there's the Broadcasting Standards Board complaints, and I'd really want to review the document. When I say, yes, I know he wanted them. He wanted the Broadcasting Standards Board complaint process terminated with respect to the Arvizos. I'm just not sure that they were parties to the litigation against Granada. It's been a long time.
All right, let's take our break.